What's your assessment of where we are right now today with the movement, and where do you see it going?
Well, I think the social media phenomenon takes it to a whole other level that wasn't there before. So I think you've got your traditional groups like, you know, skinheads, neo-Nazis, and then you've got this sort of nerdy gamer, highly intelligent, that nerd out on German philosophers and stuff like that. They're not really, very few of them I think are capable of physical violence, but they're very violent, and their violence is online. And I think, but they still have the capacity to go and do, shoot up a school or something like that, that kind of lone wolf, like a Dylan Roof type thing. When I was in my time in the movement, you had to order a book, and you'd have to wait 3 weeks for it to come. And if you want to hear someone speak, you had to go, or hear these new ideas, you had to go to a physical meeting where, you know, you have to worry about, is the police going to identify me? Will I be under surveillance? Is there going to be counter-protesters? Am I going to get beat up? And so there's the barrier to entry was like this. But now, you know, in the process then that took months and years to radicalize, you can binge watch an ideology in a weekend, you know? And the way that it spreads, there's nooks and crannies that they create that we can't get into, we don't know about, and it's certainly, it's a growing problem, and it's manifesting itself in a way that is new as the communications have evolved.
Everything he just said. But so for me, a real wake-up thing was when I was released from prison, we still had AOL dial-up, the whole, you know, like that's how you got online. So we didn't have access to what we have today. And, you know, technology, for a lot of us, we think of positive things, you know, any number of things. When the incident happened with Dylan Roof, and when I started to take a look at how he was radicalized and really realized it was completely online. There was no physical interaction like what Tony described. You know, there was no going out and actually meeting people and having these face-to-face conversations. And knowing that this was true, my brain still wanted to reject it. So I did my own experiment, and within 5 clicks went from a simple search phrase to one of the most well-known white supremacist forums on the internet, which is really scary because that means that anyone who has a grievance can type a few words in online and fall down this rabbit hole of hate, full of misinformation, full of fear, full of anger. So I think to build on what Tony said, there is that traditional aspect, you know, where there are still people in the Klan, there are still racist skinheads, but we are also having individuals that look just like everybody else, that you can't just walk into a room and say, oh hey, I see they have combat boots and swastikas tattooed on them. That's really scary. One of the scariest things that I remember was something that I saw on my way out, and it was this flyer that was a skinhead pulling a wig over his head, and he was tinkering in some machinery that was labeled ZOG, which stands for Zionist Occupied Government. And that's what we were being told to do then, assimilate, go into law enforcement, go into the military, go into the government, go into jobs where you're gonna learn skills that we're gonna need. So to see that playing out hand in hand with technology, I think it gives us more areas that we really have to be concerned about and aware of.
I think both sides, you know, if we just talk about the left and the right now, both sides are seeing the climate in this country as, in some way, shape, or form, a restoration of the pre-existing binary, predating civil rights era. You see a rolling back, but depending on which side of that coin you're on is how you're going to view the threat or the benefits of that rollback. And I think here in the West Coast, it's been predominant with, you know, rolling back some of the rules or the laws that have been put in place to protect certain populations, right? So we can see that we're just rolling back the clock, and it's not like we don't have the experience to know what that's like to live under those old rules. So then it has to be intentional, right? We know exactly what kind of climate we're trying to set. And so I think the leadership is intentional in many ways of the climate that is trying to set, with this not being politically correct and, people being too sensitive. But we're also engaging on both sides in what we're learning about with our partners is something called collective shame, in the sense that we use these broad sweeping generalizations to talk about each other, and that creates much of the grievance that we're seeing come from both sides. And those grievances are not being validated, and so that creates more disparity and more distance between the two sides, the two communities that exist out there. It's all not gloom and doom though, and I think Tony has really helped open my eyes to this, where this administration is not the beginning of these problems. And you can think that if you wait 4 years that somehow things will change for the better, if the election goes differently, but we have to understand there are a lot of people that help this climate exist that are not at that top seat. So for those of you in policy, as a social worker, you have to understand that really policy is where we have to be vigilant and where we have to be active on many fronts. And as a social worker, whether I'm in Florida working with somebody who's just getting out, or we're standing talking with federal lawmakers and law enforcement, we have to be mindful of how we're shaping narrative around policy. And this is not a discussion to be talked about in the win-lose framework. You can't win or lose this battle. What you can do, though, I believe, and that's what Life After Hate is deeply concerned with, is restoring balance. And we can restore balance in many ways by bearing witness at the very least. And this is what our bystanders who are often feeling paralyzed and what they think they may or may not be able to do. At the very least, we should be bearing witness to these atrocities, to these injustices, to the imbalance. I think that we can hold our position without sending messages that condemn other people. We can be concerned about what other people are doing, but as soon as we engage in some sort of condemning narrative, we're just playing out the old system as it stands today. And I think that we can insert a narrative, and our narrative matters, right? And so we can go from as seeing someone who's bullied, like in Angela's story, and say, "Are you okay?" to the bully, "That's not okay." To the school, "We have an issue here." To the parents, "Let's talk about this and come together and figure out what we can do." To law enforcement, do you see how that ripple effect? I started out working with homeless runaway kids. How am I now partnering with an organization dealing with white supremacy? To be honest, I followed the breadcrumbs. And the more I followed those breadcrumbs, it led me to the issues that are on a national level, deeply rooted, for lack of a better term, systemic racism, that are affecting all of these communities, from left to right, rich to poor, white to black, in a way that is really becoming difficult to get a foothold.